The ocean's fastest growing forest is disappearing, and most people don't even know it exists. Kelp forests, sprawling underwater ecosystems, are vanishing at an alarming rate. But why? Warming seas, pollution, and missing predators are pushing these vital habitats to the brink. But kelp isn't just any seaweed. It grows up to 18 inches a day, faster than almost anything on the planet, and plays a massive role in cleaning our air, supporting our marine life, and even protecting coastal communities. In today's episode, we speak with Dr. Aaron Eger from the Kelp Forest Alliance. He reveals why kelp forests are the unsung heroes of the ocean, and how restoration efforts, led in part by South Korea's Take Charge action with the Kelp Forest Alliance, it could be a game changer for our planet's future. If you care about things like breathing, clean oceans, climate change, or just want to understand what's actually happening beneath the waves, then let's dive in. This is GoodViral. Welcome to the conversation.
Hi, everybody. Welcome again to another GoodViral podcast. We're here with Dr. Eger from Kelp Forest Alliance. I want to jump right into this because this is a really compelling and interesting topic for me. It's always been difficult, really, because anybody that works or in any way with oceans and seas are so busy that it's very tough to get you guys here to join us. And the big question, I think, for myself and the listeners want to understand this better, because I think that most people like myself have limited knowledge. So can you fill us in a little bit, Dr. Eger, about why kelp, why it's important, what's the impact, and what's going on? What are you guys up to with this?
It's a big ocean. It's a big problem. Kelp forests are this incredible underwater forest system that we have across most of our world's temperate and Arctic coastlines. So you can kind of go from the tropics and up towards the pole, and that's actually kelp forest habitat. And not a lot of people know about these ecosystems, despite the fact that they're really the fabric and the sort of core foundation to coastal marine ecosystems in those regions. And with that lack of knowledge comes a lack of action to correct the problems and fix the problems, as we see kelp forests really decline for many of the same reasons that, coral reefs are declining. Warming oceans, invasive species, coastal development, pollution, all affecting kelp forests, but we're not seeing the same level of action for this ecosystem that occurs off of London, Los Angeles, New York, Vancouver, Santiago, Cape Town, Sydney, all really core, pivotal, coastal hubs. But we don't have that same movement for kelp. So what we're doing with the Kelp Forest Alliance is we're trying to create a global movement to protect and restore 4 million hectares of this vital marine ecosystem in the next 16 years.
When I was on your website, I was learning a lot. I was learning there's a difference between what we think of in seaweed, like sushi, and kelp. So I was kind of like, what's going on with kelp? And I saw on your site, as well as doing my awesome research through Google, was finding that some species of kelp, and maybe you can expand a bit on that, is the second fastest growing organism on the planet. Is that correct? Or
that's right.
And it grows like 18 inches or 45 centimeters a day.
That's absolutely right. So you can go snorkeling in a kelp forest and come back in 2 or 3 days, and it's the length of your arm, taller. We're only beaten out by bamboo, but yeah, we've got giant kelp as the second fastest growing organism on the planet. So it goes incredibly quickly, especially over those summer months where you just go snorkeling one day and you come back and it's an entirely different place.
Yeah, so it's quite interesting to me that, something that can grow back so quickly is having a hard time doing that, right?
Yeah.
So can you kind of expand a little bit about, a little bit more in terms of what is preventing these kelp forests from being able to grow so quickly or to replenish?
Well, I do think that's a great point on the sort of optimism for fixing the problem. So you can regrow a kelp forest in a year, maybe 2 years, and then all the animals that live in that forest start to come back over those next following few years as well. So to me, it is really a solvable issue when we have lost these kelp forests. It's not like we need to wait 250 years for old growth forest to reestablish. We just have to wait those 2 to 4 years for the kelp forest ecosystem to reestablish. So despite that ability to grow so fast, they're still vulnerable, right? They're still affected by the same impacts and stressors that other plants and animals are on the planet. If it's too hot, then they just don't really photosynthesize as well. So they don't grow as well. They don't reproduce as well. They are really adaptable. So there's some really promising potential in kelp's ability to adapt to warmer temperatures. There's still limits to that, but we might have a species of kelp that grows in, say, 25-degree waters here in Australia, up around Queensland, and then that same species will grow in 6 or 8-degree waters down in southern Tasmania. So there is a huge ability in these kelp to adapt to a different range of environmental conditions. But we're doing a lot of things really quickly to the ocean, and so sometimes we just push past that ability to adapt. Water gets too warm, particularly if there's a heat wave. So maybe, the average is 1.5 degrees higher than normal, but a heat wave comes along and pushes that 3, 4, 5, 6 degrees higher than normal. And that just knocks out the kelp forest. Or a really other core problem that we're seeing with kelp is they're very tightly linked to the things that eat them. They're like grass or plants, so they get munched on by herbivores all the time. It's all part of the natural system that's developed. In a healthy ecosystem, that's totally fine. Herbivores will graze on the kelp forest. The kelp grows really quickly. It can come back from that. It can sustain that grazing pressure. But what we now see is after removing predators from a system, so you take out things like sea otters or big predatory fish or lobsters, which like to eat the things that eat the kelp. Very often it's something called a sea urchin, which you might be familiar with, like stepped on at the beach, that big spiky ball, loves to eat kelp forest. And so by removing the top predator, we release this pressure on the sea urchin. There's nothing to eat them, so they just go to town, reproduce, overpopulate, and then they can wipe out a kelp forest and transform it from this really forest-like system, really exactly like a forest. You're sitting at the bottom, you're looking up. There's trunks and canopies and swaying and birds flying around, except they're fish and all sorts of analogies that you can really just plug into going for a walk on the land forest. And it can take that and it will transform it into something really analogous to a desert. It's just flat, it's empty, it looks like the moon, it's bare rock. And we're really having to deal with that issue in a number of places around the world where we've disrupted these food webs.
So from I guess a scientific standpoint, really trying to understand the attention. I remember there's a great film called Cowspiracy. Don't know if you're familiar with that, but it was talking about how if the same things were happening on land that are happening in the oceans, then everybody would be up in arms, right? And so that's the thing, is that it's really unseen for us, and so therefore, not only do we not understand it, but we don't give it the attention usually that it needs. And so, to understand, can you fill us in a little bit about how that ecosystem interacts with other things that we don't see in the ocean, and how that, of course, affects not only, because usually we think, on your website, it talks about fisheries closing and so forth, and these are some impacts that human beings are going to experience, right? But then, as a selfish species, we're usually only concerned about us, right? And there's a much bigger picture that we don't understand that also impacts us. So, can you explain to us a little bit about
how kelp forests link into other systems,
how it connects to what else is in the ocean, how that may be important to the planet, and to, in turn, in indirect ways besides fisheries, and his fisheries as well, how that would connect or relate to human beings and things that we may not see or understand.
For sure. So I really take to calling kelp forests the fabric of our cold water seas. And that's A, because I'm a little bit biased and I love kelp, but B, I think really quite objectively true in that they are this foundation species. Keeping with that forest analogy, they create the structure for animals to live in. They create the biomass for animals to eat. So you start taking that out of the system and everything just falls apart. There's going to be less of everything within an ocean ecosystem. If there's less energy being fueled through it, there's less space to live, there's less space to hunt in both directions. There's just an absence of structure and energy flowing through. So it absolutely affects things like economic fisheries, but it also just really underpins these coastal ecosystems, which, as I stressed, is really a massive chunk of our coastline. About 1/3 of our world's coastline has a kelp forest stretching across it. In these colder waters where you have rocky reef, you tend to have a kelp forest. So their significance is incredible on the global scale, both for people and also just for the overall health of the ocean. And indeed, that's a message we're really trying to get across, in that we are advocating for an increased kelp forest conservation, restoration, protection awareness, but it's all linked. You could just replace the word kelp with ocean in a lot of these areas, and you'd be coming with similar sort of solutions or activities that need to take place. So we love kelp because they are the foundation in much of these coastlines, but then they're also linked to everything else, from snails to whales.
When you talk about kelp forests, I was looking at your website, looking at all the photos that you have, like a photo contest as well, which was beautiful. And one of them reminded me of the documentary My Octopus Teacher. It's pretty popular and on Netflix. If those who have not seen it do, it's beautifully made. And it's in South Africa. And this guy is just swimming around basically in this kelp forest, small kelp forest. And it's absolutely amazing. Normally, my experience with kelp has been slimy, tangly, getting in the way of my waves. But then watching that documentary, I started to realize it's actually quite beautiful if you really get down there. And I saw a picture of you. I think you're just laying in the kelp at the bottom of the ocean. And I was like, that would be quite a great view looking up. From the bottom of the ocean floor, looking up into this forest. That would feel like you're in a sense on land, looking up into that forest. And so it reminded me of the Octopus Teacher. And it also got me thinking, with the amount of I was also looking at your maps, with the amount of kelp forest that's been going away because of all the issues you mentioned. It also made me look at the numbers you had for carbon captured based off of the efforts with the Kelp Forest Alliance. And I did my little maths sheet here. So forgive me if some of the numbers aren't quite exact. But on your website, you mentioned you estimated 486 approximately 1,000 tons of CO2 carbon captured. And, when I see these big numbers, I kind of have to have a visualization of what that looks like. And so for those who have listened to a few of these episodes, here I go again. Basically, the 486,000 tons of CO2 can equal driving a gas car over 243 million miles when you're going 65 miles an hour or 104 kilometers an hour. And so if you're in this car and you're driving 243 million miles, this basically approximately equates 426 years of driving. And I'm just like, that's insane. That's an insane amount of CO2 captured. And, I just want to kind of give it applause to that, because I'm sure all the octopus appreciate it, but also our world can appreciate it, because a lot of us don't think about the oceans being a carbon sink. We tend to think of trees and things like that, which are important, but the ocean itself is quite the carbon sink. So could you just kind of make a little comment on that, the efforts that's happened with that, with the Kelp Forest Alliance, and specifically something about South Korea being pretty imperative to all of these efforts as well?
Yeah, no, there's quite a lot to unpack in that. And kelp does have this wonderful, almost magical way of integrating into all sorts of elements of life, whether it's, Oscar Netflix documentaries or offsetting your car or cultural connections in Korea that inspire restoration efforts. It filters across all these sort of avenues and circles of life, which I just really love experiencing as a person trained in science, but then I end up coming across all these different backgrounds. So going into the oceans and carbon capture, there's a number of organisms in the ocean that capture carbon in the same way that plants on land do. And you think of how big the oceans are, that's an incredible amount of space that can, have these organisms growing. Some of them are teeny tiny little phytoplankton that might get eaten or sink to the bottom of the ocean, or the animals that eat them sink to the bottom of the ocean and capture carbon in that way. Then you have things like seaweeds, kelp forests, seagrasses that are actually growing plant-like structures. And then some portion of that is transported off into the deep sea, where it's effectively buried or locked away, really. And that really contributes to that need to mitigate human CO2 emissions in the atmosphere. So the 400,000 tons of CO2 that you're referencing, that's just based on the area of kelp that's been restored. So that's sort of additional CO2 that's been pulled out of the atmosphere based on kelp restoration efforts. The amount for all global kelp forests is going to be much, much larger. I think one estimate we had was about 32 million tons of CO2 equivalent from naturally occurring kelp forests. They are very hard to map. They live underwater, deep, cold, dark waters, 20 meters, 30 meters, 40 meters sometimes. So we are doing our best just to get those basic maps and understand really how significant they are to carbon capture and the carbon cycle. And that is indeed really one of the big motivations people have to do the restoration sometimes, is to enhance that carbon cycle, enhance that carbon capture. And looking at Korea, they really take that full suite approach that I was talking about just a second ago. They see the blue carbon side of it, but it's also incredibly important from a cultural component in that it's a very ocean-based, marine-based culture and country. A lot of their diet is still derived from the sea, either through kelp directly or animals that are linked to kelp forests, or again, just that sort of appreciation of the need to tend for or care for the ocean. So they actually have a day, May 10th, coming up, Marine Gardening Day. And that is just all about celebrating our connection to the sea, the ocean, and thinking about how we can take care of the ocean in the same way that the ocean might take care of us. And that's really, all of that philosophy has really accumulated in their Seaforestation or their kelp restoration program, which is set out to do 54,000 hectares of kelp restoration by 2030. And that places it at the largest restoration project by, a factor of 15 to 20 at current date. So they're really leading the charge, and they're showing, I think, what can be done. And a lot of the work that we do with the Kelp Forest Alliance is to break down these cultural, professional, what have you, barriers that exist between people trying to do good things in the kelp space and have them share ideas and enhance projects around the world. So we've been trying to work quite closely with our partners in Korea to learn their sort of best practices and how we can apply that technology and information to doing kelp forest restoration all around the world, and really celebrate the connections and the action that the South Korean government has been taking for kelp forests over the last 16 years. It's been running since 2009. So they set out with a 21-year program. There's just not a lot of foresight that you see in other government programs. Oftentimes they're quite short. So they've just kind of done the right thing in every category and trying to make this happen for kelp forests in South Korea.
We will get back to the conversation with Dr. Eger in a moment. Are you feeling inspired by what you heard? Now's the time to turn that energy into action. Dive deeper with the Kelp Forest Alliance at kelpforestalliance.com. They're leading a global movement to restore millions of hectares to these incredible underwater forests. And they need your help. Check out their socials and get involved in protecting one of the ocean's most powerful superheroes. All the links are right there in the description. Don't just listen, be part of the change. Now, back to the conversation with Dr. Eger.
Yeah, we've had on our podcast, we've had guests talking about the Amazon forest. We've had guests talking about coral. So I think that especially when we talk about the rainforests, for a lot of people, again, it's easy to understand that the rainforests are essential, that we need them. And I'm trying to understand better. So if, for example, if people just ignore kelp and just treat it, like we don't understand the impact, and maybe it's not very important, right? So can you talk about some of the consequences really of the path that we're on, and if the kelp forests are just sort of left without any of our help, what kind of negative impacts might we see?
Again, we can continue straight with the forest analogy of taking that rainforest and transitioning to a desert. And that is most of the time what happens when you lose a kelp forest. So with that, you lose the oxygen that's produced by the forest, you lose the carbon that's captured and cycled, you lose the nutrient cycling, you lose the habitat, you lose the food for the species of the animals that live there, you lose the ability to go there yourself, you lose the ability to have that connection to your culture that's existed for however many millennia based on that relationship between people and nature, and it's just disappeared. So there's sort of tangible, yes, the multi-million-dollar abalone fishery is collapsing, and then there's the more sort of intrinsic, this is just something that has sustained a culture or society for millennia, living all on the coastline, and that's no longer there for their children to experience or to understand or to experience themselves. So there's a lot on the line, really, when we lose a kelp forest over a large coastal area, because it is so intrinsically linked, as I've been trying to stress, to just the general ocean health for those areas. You might not know it because there's just not the same amount of attention to kelp as there is to, say, coral reefs. But for most of our world's coastlines, they're really that key habitat that we need to care about when we think of oceans.
And I'm kind of sitting here thinking, what happens in someone's life to start geeking out about kelp? Like, what was your story where you're just like, kelp is awesome and I want to get a doctorate in it? Like, tell us a little bit about that.
I went swimming one day, kelp touched me, and my life was forever changed. No, I think kelp for me sat in this really interesting intersection. I was starting out my science career. I had passion or motivation to try to have that positive impact with my research or with my work. And then with that, you want to start looking, where is the need? What isn't being done that needs to be done? You don't want to be one of 1,000. You want to be one of one, kind of thing. And kelp forests were just so neglected. There was this, as I said, intersection of a habitat ecosystem of incredible global importance that was just really almost entirely overlooked, particularly at the international level in terms of conservation action. So we've got some analysis that shows that, every time kelp forests are mentioned in international policy, seagrass, mangroves, salt marsh, coral reefs are included 8 to 44 times more. And that's just the marine habitats. If you took that to the terrestrial habitats, that would be even astronomically out of proportion. So for me, looking to help the oceans, kelp was just there. I'm a cold water boy. I grew up in Canada. I feel that sort of need to protect something that I relate to and sustains that ecological identity that I grew up with. It is just, as I said, the fabric for Canadian seas. It's the fabric for Southern Australian seas where I work now and live now. So it was needed. It was needed, and it had the potential. And that's really how I kind of got consumed in the kelp space. And then there's just been so many incredible things to work on since then, because, as I said, that there's just this huge potential to actually make it happen.
And you mentioned, I want to go back to something you mentioned, because I just recently, my brother sent me this thing talking about how coconuts kill more people every year than sharks do. And I replied, great. Now when I'm swimming, I have to be afraid of coconuts, right? But but you talked about the predators. So what's going on there? Why are predators being eliminated, as you said, or I don't know if that's the right word, but if you take away the predators, then you take away what's eating the sea urchins. And so what's the reason for that? Because it seems like we're seeing collapse from many different angles. So there's the kelp are at risk in so many different ways. But then you mentioned the predators, and I want to understand that better, because I know that sharks are given a bad rap, and of course I don't think otters, or sea otters, or sea lions, seals are usually looked at in a bad way unless they're competing directly with the fishermen. So can you talk about that a little bit so we can understand that a little bit better?
Yeah, I mean, minus sea otters, the short answer is they're tasty. But those are the things people just really like to eat. Lobsters, big predatory fish, that's sort of prized fish that people like to see on their plate or at the market. And there's multiple levels to it. So there's sort of that basic 1, 2, 3 level that I've been talking about with kelp forest. So that might be like a sheephead wrasse in California, or a blue groper here in Australia, or some sort of rockfish back in Canada, which actually interacts with that sea urchin. Whereas like an apex predator, like an orca or a great white shark, is above that and won't necessarily have that direct link there. But there has been some research starting to look at that link as well, and links between orcas and otters and urchins and kelp forests, and understanding how changes in those populations trickle through the food web. So it's all very much interlinked, but when it comes to sort of most direct management interactions, we tend to focus on that basic 1, 2, 3 step, and focusing on those sort of mid first level predators that would either eat the sea urchin or the sometimes herbivorous fish that would otherwise eat the kelp forest.
When it comes to replanting or restoring a kelp forest, I understand, on terrestrial, you plant a tree in the ground. Is that the same in terms of kelp? You just put it in the seabed, or how does that usually work?
So the way I look at it is planting a kelp forest is just like planting a tree, except you cannot breathe and you're trying to dig into stone instead of soil. So it's a lot trickier. It's really one of the main limiting factors that we have is that technological capability to get the reproductive kelp material onto the bottom of the ocean and get it to stay there to attach and to regrow. So a lot of it's really manual, small scale work that's being done at the moment. This could be people tying existing kelp on the seafloor, attaching bolts or attaching sort of grid structures to tie the kelp onto, and then letting them do their reproduction. There's been some interesting exploration, and I think will be the path to follow, looking at getting that sort of seed stage of the kelp and just having that distribute, that spread across the seafloor quite naturally. You think of like a crop duster or sort of how you would do it in an agricultural system. And that's what Korea has played with a little bit. They've taken their existing kelp farming technology and started to think about how they can use that to restore the ocean. And then that's where I think we really need to go to scale up this reintroduction of kelp into the ecosystem. We're also thinking about which species do we want to bring back? What are the sort of traits or tolerances that they might have for slightly warmer waters, or which populations might we try to prioritize based on the probability that they're going to survive if the water's 2 degrees warmer. So there's a lot more thinking into the technological application of planting kelp that needs to happen. But continue to harp on my point on the sort of lack of attention that the subject's received, we really at this point have some ecologists trying to solve the problem. These are people who think about how does the sea otter eat the urchin who eats the kelp forest, and they might do it with like some, we would say Bunnings here or like Home Depot back home, just chop shop application methods of doing these little small scale experiments with a bucket and a shovel. They're not engineers, they're not biochemists, they're not these sort of people with the skill sets that would solve these kind of technical problems. So I think as we get more interest, we get more support, they're very solvable. We're just, we're just not quite there yet in the sort of people hours and people expertise that are being applied to the problem.
If you've made it this far, you know GoodViral is all about spotlighting people and organizations who are actually making a difference, like Charity Water, Gorilla Doctors, Rainforest Action Network, and so much more. To keep doing that, we'd love your support. Become a GoodViral member at goodviral.org and help us grow this mission. Starting in August, members will get early access to episodes, exclusive behind-the-scenes content with our guests, deeper dives into articles, and abilities to join us live during the interviews to ask your own questions in the chat. If you believe in the power of stories to inspire action, come be part of it. Join us at goodviral.org/memberships. Our motto always has been and always will be, when good goes viral, the world gets better. Thank you for being part of the conversation.
So just quickly, it sounds like it's an expensive problem that could be prevented in terms of more kelp forests becoming kelp deserts or ocean deserts. And so it's actually in the better interest to conserve what we have and restore what we destroyed rather than to continue letting things destroy. Therefore, we need to rehabilitate even more. That's what I heard.
Protect what you have, restore what you cannot, have the grace to know the difference.
So so what are you all up to now? So we were talking a bit ago, Anastasia and I, about the organization, the Alliance. So can you explain that? What is it that you guys are really up to, and what are you working on now that's exciting to you? What's going on with your work that might be the most compelling, most interesting part of what you're up to?
So our biggest movement project is the Kelp Forest Challenge, and that's this effort to both protect and restore kelp forests around the world. So 3 million of the 4 million hectares are dedicated for protecting existing kelp forests, and then 1 million hectares are for restoring kelp forests that have been degraded or disappeared. And what we're trying now is to really get that large-scale, national-level government intervention into solving this problem. So we've created the Alliance. It continues to grow, but now we're at about 680 people working in kelp forest conservation. all around the world, 26 countries. And we're now taking the sort of pitch to governments to try to get them to meet existing targets they've already agreed to. Pretty much every country on the planet has already agreed to international targets related to biodiversity loss. And so we're now working with them to meet those targets for kelp forests. And essentially this looks like, maybe not as quite exciting, but it's a lot of meetings, it's a lot of interaction, it's a lot of information sharing at that national level, but also within those individual collectives in each region or each country that can really connect then to that high level policy. Because where a lot of these initiatives often fall short is, there's a lot of people doing good work, but they don't have the keys to the tower and they don't have that sort of interaction with policy or government to make it happen. Or there's a lot of policy government people who have a lot of high level rhetoric and a lot of great ideas, but they don't actually have the realization of what's happening on the ground. So we are continually working to bridge that gap and bring these alliances from different regions to the relevant governments and represent kelp forests internationally. So these are things like the UN Climate COP or the UN Biodiversity COP, and just making sure that kelp forests are on the agenda for that. And so what we do with our work is really try to accelerate everything that's happening. We try to get more funding for it, more policy support, more research ability, more education and awareness, and really just have this kelp movement take off all around the world. We've been going for about 2.5 years now, and it's tripled in size. And I think it's just going to continue to grow, especially as we find links that people might not necessarily expect from the get-go of kelp and their profession or their culture or their recreational experience. But we started working with companies like Google, for instance, who are using their AI technology to map kelp forests, or the same technology to examine the genome of specific populations to see which ones are best suited to survive in warmer waters. And there's all sorts of partnerships like this that I think are going to pop up that can be applied into kelp forest conservation. And some of it's just fun, like little stories or photo competitions, like you mentioned, or short films. Again, having that personal connection for people to link to, understand, experience kelp, and get involved. So this sort of rising tide of the global kelp movement is kind of my continually exciting piece that's happening. But we are starting to get very strategic in how to actually make that happen with these local coalitions and direct connections to government to really make change happen at the relevant scale and make it happen ethically. We don't want to swoop in and propose all these solutions that nobody actually wants. It's all about bringing that sort of grassroots action and then connecting it to that high level dialogue and then seeing the best that can happen.
As we start to kind of round out our conversation here, you brought up local cultures, and we've talked a bit about fisheries that are closing, and local cultures, especially indigenous, tend to be a little bit more associated with however many thousands of years of fishing in those waters. And I saw on your website that you have somebody on staff or volunteering that works with indigenous communities. And so I'm not sure if you could comment a little bit more on that and how they get a little bit more involved with the movement and the alliance.
Absolutely. So most coastal nations, tribes, indigenous groups in temperate and Arctic regions are going to have a link to kelp forests just because of that connection to the ocean. As I've been saying, kelp forests are just so deeply connected to ocean health and sustainability and sustenance in these regions. It's not been a topic that's received a whole heap of attention to date. So we're actually working on a new project just as a first sort of listening experience to bring together different indigenous groups from around the world and hear sort of where kelp fits into their ocean management strategies, into their culture, their experience with environmental management, and what the really key priorities and needs are to accelerate or empower action to more sustainably manage kelp forests and the ocean in their regions. So it's an ongoing effort. I think a lot of what will happen will be dictated from the perspective of the people in those regions. Again, not wanting to force any solutions on any group, person, or organization, but really see what's needed and try to provide that capacity. And that's where the alliance is so powerful, right? We start to do this in a few locations around the world, and that spreads to other locations and then more locations, and it all kind of ripples up or down depending which direction you're going to. And so this is our first sort of foray into the avenue. And then we expect that really to grow as more groups become involved, and we can empower that side of kelp forest management across the world.
I feel like, I don't know why this occurred to me, but this whole thing for me feels a little bit like we're trying to communicate with an alien species, trying to understand them, and they're trying to understand humanity, because it seems like the oceans are not really, or haven't been very well understood. In other words, I think about, in my lifetime, right, the talk has been about coral, it's been about whales. If I was on a boat somewhere, floating around, and somebody said to me, hey, well, what do you think about kelp and what's going on? I would be like, what do you mean? So I think that it's educational, but it's interesting because as you're talking, it's like, okay, this is like, in many ways, a missing link to the picture, understanding the seas. And of course, when we talk about coastal, we're talking about the oceans, but also how the oceans relate to us as human beings. Where we meet the oceans is on the coastline. And so it just seems to me, I'm trying to summarize here, but I'm also trying to sort of understand better. It seems to me that this is really, in many ways, a very, very important link to really the ongoing survival of the oceans, the seas, and the fishing industry, our connection to the seas. So can you just speak in general, or because I don't know what the question really is, I'm just trying to really learn. And I think a lot of people don't understand very well. And when we talk about, what would you say, I guess this is really the question, what would you say is the big thing that in your experience, people need to know or need to learn about kelp, and what is the information that the human species hasn't understood so far and that we're just really waking up to now?
It's a very high level answer, and it's just the kelp itself, because so many people aren't even aware that kelp is a thing, or if they are aware of it, they might think it's what you eat in your sushi roll, which is not. That's a different kind of seaweed. Or it's the thing that washes up on the beach and it's a bit stinky and slimy, but it doesn't really play any other important factor. So we're really just working to break this sort of cultural amnesia that exists in many parts of the world about the importance of kelp and that really direct link to the ocean and therefore to people between this wonderful seaweed that grows really, really quickly and hosts all these incredible animals and everything that sort of spirals up from there. Again, Japan and Korea in particular have deep cultural appreciations of kelp forests, and that's been reflected in action and policies to protect and restore those habitats. But it's just missing, I think, for much of the other parts of the world due to where we get our food or where we go on vacation and these sorts of things and what we think of when we think of the ocean. But there's an opportunity really to remedy that. And I think now, there is this big sort of push to reconnect to nature following certain events of 2020 and 2022 in that sort of period, lockdowns and whatnot. There's an opportunity to have that blue backyard experience. A lot of people listening to this or reading about kelp forests, go out and explore and understand. You don't need to fly to Indonesia or the Bahamas to go have a marine biodiversity vacation. You can go snorkel in a kelp forest, see a seal, see a sea otter, see a lobster, see a bright, colorful fish, find things you never possibly thought existed outside of a storybook. And it's right there in your blue backyard. So if I ask anything for someone to come away from this, it's just kelp. It's there. It's waiting for you to interact with it. And there's a whole kind of world you can unlock once you take a look.
Quickly, before we wrap up, is there like a Kelp Geek Club or something that people could possibly join, or is that the Kelp Forest Alliance?
I guess it's kind of the Kelp Forest Alliance. Yeah, we're very open. So anyone who's got an interest in kelp forest is welcome to be involved in the network and can participate more or less. You might not necessarily jump into a working group if you traditionally work as a finance lawyer, but you can certainly follow what's happening, follow stories about kelp forest, Think about ways that you might loan whatever skills you have. Maybe if you are a finance lawyer, then there's an opportunity for you to help fundraise for a program or look at some legal restoration policy that needs to be done, or just think about however you fit into this world and how that might be linked to a kelp forest, because there really are just all these sort of unimagined links between kelp and the rest of society that people are just starting to understand.
Well, thank you so much. This was quite an awesome and a very educational experience for me, at least.
Yes.
Because Demian was the one that found you guys, and I kind of went into this a little bit blind. And so I was like, okay, let me research, this alliance and kelp in general and all that. And the more I started to research into it, the more I was like, kelp is cool. This is really interesting. Never even thought about this stuff. No one ever talks about this stuff. And it should be. And I think you're right, is that the world's waking up to it a bit. And we're hoping that with this podcast, those who are listening will take action and go to your social medias, go to your website, join in the cause, donate, or as well as, if you have a skill that will be valuable, to offer that. And do a little contribution to your blue backyard. So those who are listening, please do some of those things that attract you, and definitely dive in with Dr. Eger, Aaron, and all of his crew. Thank you so much for being part of the podcast. We really appreciate you being here and being part of the conversation.
Absolutely my pleasure. Always love a chat about kelp forest, and any way we can help the kelp, think about it, get people exploring. More than happy to follow up in a different conversation.
Thank you for listening to the Good Viral podcast and being part of the conversation. If you are inspired by this episode, go to our website at goodviral.org, where you can find resources and listings from the episode to continue good efforts.
Like, comment, and share this episode to any or all of your social media channels. It's really easy to take a small action, and maybe you'll inspire a big result.
When good goes viral, the world gets better.